The screaming started before I even finished mounting the second camera. "You can't do that. Take IT down right now." I turned around on the ladder, drill still in hand, and there she was, Rochelle Perkins, the HOA vice president, standing on my lawn like she owned it. Her platinum bob was stiff in the breeze, and her arms were crossed so hard it looked like her elbows might snap. "My property, Rochelle," I said, cool as a fridge. "I checked the bylaws. Security systems are allowed." She scoffed, storming closer until she was almost at my porch. "Not visible ones. You're violating the aesthetic standards of the community." I looked at the small, black dome camera barely noticeable under the eaves. "What aesthetic? It's a camera, not a billboard." She pointed a manicured finger at my face. "You want to be difficult, Vincent? Fine. But don't cry when the fines start rolling in." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I had receipts, literally. I'd printed out the HOA bylaws last night, highlighted the section that clearly said outdoor security was permitted so long as it didn't obstruct sidewalks or neighbor property. Mine didn't. I was careful like that. I finished installing the third camera while Rochelle paced across the street, fake calling someone on her phone like she had backup. I knew the HOA president, Harold, was out of town. Rochelle had been dying to flex authority since the day she got voted in as VP. It didn't take long for the first letter to show up. 3 days later, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to my front door, yes, taped like it was a high school prank. Inside was a violation notice. Failure to comply with community appearance guidelines. Immediate removal of surveillance equipment required. Daily fines accrue at $50. I laughed. My cameras caught her walking up and slapping the letter on my door. The next morning, I went to the HOA office. Rochelle was sitting behind the desk like she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. "I'm appealing this," I said, tossing the letter on the counter. "You can't appeal until it's reviewed by the board," she snapped, "which won't happen until next month." I leaned in. "So I'm supposed to rack up $1,500 in fake fines before I'm allowed to challenge it?" "You should have thought of that before you decided to play Big Brother," she said, smug and sharp. That's when I knew this wasn't about cameras, it was about control, so I started digging. I pulled up city statutes, emailed the county clerk, even got a buddy of mine from law school. I went for a year before switching to construction to walk me through the legal jargon. And what I found? Rochelle was way out of line. Those fines, illegal, her letter not board approved. That HOA office she claimed was the clubhouse, not zoned for administrative use. I had a plan. And Rochelle wasn't going to like it. I didn't waste time. The next morning I was at City Hall, not to complain, no, I was there to file a formal zoning inquiry. If Rochelle wanted to play games, I was going to bring the full rulebook. The clerk behind the glass partition was polite, probably because I showed up with a binder full of printed documents and a thumb drive with time-stamped video files. "Just need to verify the usage classification for this address," I said, sliding a printed map of the neighborhood to him. "This lot here listed as a clubhouse. I want the original zoning application, current designation, and any variance requests filed in the past 5 years. He looked surprised. Most people don't come in asking for that sort of thing unless they're prepping for a court hearing. I also filed a complaint with the Code Enforcement Division. That building Rochelle used as her personal office, it had been converted from a single-car garage. No visible signage, no posted operating hours, no fire inspection certificate. I had photos from the day I visited her sitting behind a folding table, loose wires dangling from a surge protector under her laptop. If anything, she was in violation of at least 3 municipal codes. Back home, I reviewed footage from my new cameras, and that's when I noticed something odd. Late at night around 2 in the morning, someone had walked up to my property line, looked directly into the camera, and then turned and walked away. No hoodie, no disguise. Just a man in a navy windbreaker with something tucked under his arm. He hadn't knocked. He didn't leave anything. Just stood there for about 20 seconds, staring. I zoomed in. His face was grainy but familiar. It was Greg Harlan, treasurer of the HOA board. By noon, I had the footage backed up in 3 places. One copy went to a local attorney I'd hired for a flat-fee consultation. Another to a USB I kept in my truck's glove box. Third went to my cloud drive. I wasn't taking chances. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, held at the so-called clubhouse. I showed up early and waited outside, leaning against my truck. Rochelle arrived 10 minutes later in her white crossover, scowling the moment she saw me. "You're not on the agenda," she said, stepping out in heels that didn't quite match the cracked sidewalk. "Doesn't matter, I'm a dues-paying homeowner. The meetings are public under the HOA charter." She narrowed her eyes. "Then sit quietly, no disruptions." Inside, the room was barely furnished. A plastic folding table with 3 mismatched chairs behind it, one flickering fluorescent light above. Greg and a woman named Lillian, secretary of the board, were already seated. No one looked particularly thrilled to see me. The meeting started with the usual nonsense: budget reports, landscaping contracts, talk of repainting curbs. I waited. Then, during new business, I stood. "I'm submitting a motion to censure the vice president for unauthorized enforcement actions and misuse of HOA resources." Greg looked up, startled. Lillian froze mid-scribble. Rochelle's chair screeched as she pushed back from the table. "You don't have standing to submit motions," she snapped. "Actually, I do," I said, pulling out a copy of the HOA charter and handing it to Lillian. "Section 7, subsection 3, any member in good standing may propose motions during the open forum subject to board vote." Lillian read it, slowly, then nodded. "He's right." Rochelle's face drained of color. I passed copies of my documentation to each board member. A full breakdown of her false violation notice, the zoning violations from the so-called clubhouse, and a screenshot of Greg's face from my security footage. Greg leaned back, arms crossed. "He was just walking his dog," Rochelle said quickly. "He didn't have a leash or a dog," I replied. "But let's say he was. Why was he on my side fence at 2 in the morning staring into my camera lens?" Greg said nothing. I didn't stop there. "I also filed a request for public zoning records with the city. Turns out this building we're in, it was never registered as an administrative space for the HOA, no variance, no occupancy permit, and no fire inspection since at least 2011. Lillian looked horrified. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," Rochelle said, trying to regain control. "No, Rochelle," I said, stepping forward and placing my final document on the table. "You are. And you're going to stand in front of a judge and explain why you've been issuing fines without board votes, operating a non-compliant facility, and authorizing nighttime visits to residents' properties." Greg stood up. "This is ridiculous. You think a judge is going to care about some zoning technicalities?" "Actually," I said, "the city attorney I spoke to this morning seemed very interested. Especially when I mentioned the misuse of collected dues to fund what appears to be an illegal operation. And I've already filed a formal grievance with the state's Department of Consumer Protection." That shut everyone up. 2 days later, I received a notice from the city. They were sending an inspector to evaluate the HOA's clubhouse. I made sure to be home that afternoon. Watched from my porch with a cup of coffee as the inspector issued a stop-use order and taped a red notice across the door. Rochelle stood nearby, visibly trembling. The next week, summonses were delivered to both her and Greg. Civil court proceedings. Misuse of HOA funds, unlawful enforcement actions, and operating in violation of city code. I was listed as the primary complainant. The court date came faster than expected. Inside the municipal courtroom, it wasn't flashy. Just a small room with a judge, a clerk, and a few rows of benches. Rochelle looked like she hadn't slept. Greg didn't show up at all. Their attorney, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to downplay everything. "Your Honor, these were simple misunderstandings. My client was attempting to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood against an escalating pattern of the judge cut him off. I've reviewed the filings, counsel. The HOA's own charter states that all enforcement actions must be approved by a quorum vote. I see no minutes reflecting such a vote. Furthermore, the unauthorized use of this residential structure as an administrative office, coupled with the issuance of fines not supported by the bylaws, suggests a gross overreach. Rochelle looked like she might faint. Then the judge turned to me. "Mr. Reyes, do you have anything further you'd like to add?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'd like to enter video evidence showing Mr. Harlan, the HOA treasurer, approaching my property in the middle of the night without cause or consent." The judge accepted the submission. After watching 30 seconds of the footage in silence, she looked back at Rochelle's counsel. "Counsel, your client is fortunate this is civil court. If I were the prosecutor in a criminal trespass case, this would be Exhibit A." The attorney didn't argue. In the end, the judge issued a cease and desist order against the HOA board. All fines against me were voided, and Rochelle was ordered to step down pending a full audit of the board's finances. Greg was removed automatically for failure to appear. Outside the courtroom, Rochelle didn't say a word, but I saw her face. Whatever power she thought she had, it was gone. And the cameras, still up, still recording, still legal. But now the whole neighborhood had started putting them up. Even old Mr. Delaney across the street had one on his fence post. Funny thing about bullies, once someone stands up to them, they don't look so tall anymore. 3 weeks after the hearing, the neighborhood stopped whispering and started talking. It began with a clipboard. Mrs. Velez, who lived 3 doors down and ran a small flower stand out of her garage, knocked on my door holding a petition. She'd always been polite, but never chatty. This time, she didn't even wait for me to invite her in. "You were right to fight them," she said, stepping into my foyer. "I thought it was just me. They fined me for having too many hanging plants last year. Said it was clutter. Then they threatened to report my stand for operating a business out of a residence. Never saw a single vote about it. I signed her petition without asking what it was. By the end of the week, over 30 households had joined. Turns out, Rochelle's reign had been more aggressive than anyone realized. There were threats to shut down backyard barbecues, warnings for unauthorized welcome mats, and in one case, a notice mailed to a widow for having a flagpole that exceeded visual compliance parameters. The pole hadn't even been taller than her porch light. It was a full-on pattern of abuse. And then came the discovery that changed everything. A quiet guy named Darren, who worked nights and kept to himself, showed up at my door with a duffel bag and a look of someone who just realized his tax return had been stolen. Said he used to do accounting for small businesses. Said he'd started digging through the HOA financials after the court hearing because something didn't add up. He laid out his findings on my kitchen table. Page after page of expense reports, some of them handwritten, the rest printed but unsigned. Dozens of charges marked as maintenance or legal consulting that never matched any actual services performed. "There's over 20,000 missing," Darren said, tapping a highlighted line. "And that's just from the last fiscal year." I cross-checked the bank statements they posted online with the quarterly reports they mailed out. Numbers don't match anywhere. I leaned over the papers. "Where do you think the money went?" He looked at me with the kind of expression people wear when they know the answer but don't want to say it out loud. Shell vendors. Fake landscaping company, consultants with no licenses. I think they created dummy accounts to siphon it. That's when I called Detective Wesson. I'd done some drywall work on his house last summer. He was with the county's white-collar crimes unit. I didn't expect him to jump in right away, but once he saw Darren's documents, he asked if we had more. We did. Darren and I spent the next 4 days going through archived financial statements, old board newsletters, and scanned checks residents had saved. The deeper we went, the more obvious it became. Rochelle and Greg had been cooking the books for years, not just mismanaging embezzling. Wesson took it from there. Subpoenas went out to the HOA's bank, the fake vendors, and the management company they'd supposedly hired. Within 10 days, Rochelle was served at her front door. No warning, no chance to slink away. 2 squad cars pulled up and she was led out in handcuffs, still wearing her silk robe and house slippers. People watched from their windows. No one looked surprised. That same afternoon, a warrant was issued for Greg. He tried to leave town. Made it as far as the next county before being picked up at a gas station, trying to pay for a tank of premium with a card tied to one of the fake vendor accounts. The next HOA meeting was unlike any we'd had before. Held in the community park this time, with folding chairs set up under the pavilion, it was run by a temporary oversight committee appointed by the city. A state auditor spoke first, explaining that the HOA's books were under full review. Then Wesson gave a brief rundown of the charges: wire fraud, tax evasion, and criminal conspiracy to commit financial abuse. But it was the city attorney, a sharp woman named Marla Chen, who delivered the real hammer. "There is sufficient evidence," she said, "that multiple board members engaged in deliberate acts of financial deception. This includes creating non-existent service providers and billing the HOA for work never performed. At least one account was traced directly to a personal credit line used for luxury purchases." She held up a photograph. Rochelle, in a boutique downtown, holding a handbag that cost more than most people's rent. The crowd gasped. "Further," Marla continued, "it appears that enforcement actions including fines, threats, and property violations were used as a form of coercion to prevent homeowners from questioning these activities. That is textbook abuse of power under civil code." The pavilion went silent. Then Mr. Patel, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, stood up. "I always thought something was off," he said, voice steady. "They fined me for a bird bath. A bird bath, said it was a pest attractor. I asked for a hearing. They said it was already decided." People nodded, one by one, more stood. A nurse said they threatened to tow her car because she parked in her own driveway during a night shift. A veteran said they warned him about his American flag. A couple said they received violation letters every time their kids left bikes on the lawn for more than 5 minutes. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity. The Oversight Committee announced a full re-election of the board, supervised by the city. Until then, all enforcement actions were suspended. Fines issued in the past 3 years were to be reviewed, and reimbursements issued where appropriate. That night, I reviewed my camera footage again, not for security this time, but to compile a timeline. Every visit, every letter, every moment Rochelle or Greg tried to intimidate me was now evidence in a broader case. The county prosecutor filed formal charges 2 weeks later. Rochelle pled not guilty, but her bail was denied after it came out she'd moved over $10,000 into a Cayman Islands account 2 months before her arrest. Greg tried to pin everything on her. Didn't work. The trial was set for the fall, but the community didn't wait to change. With Rochelle and Greg gone, people started talking again. Kids rode bikes without paranoid glances. Flags waved proudly from porches. The garage sales returned, and the cameras, they stayed up, not as a form of defense but as a symbol. When the local news came to cover the story, they asked me what started it all. I told them the truth. It was never about the cameras. It was about being told I didn't have the right to protect what's mine. That's how it always starts, someone trying to convince you that their authority overrides your rights. All I did was say no. They asked if I had advice for people dealing with corrupt HOAs. I laughed, but it wasn't bitter. Know your bylaws. Document everything. And when someone threatens you with power they don't actually have, don't flinch. Just hit record. By winter, the community had elected a new board, diverse, transparent, and fully volunteer. No salaries. No secret deals. Monthly meetings were held in the library room at the local rec center, with agendas posted a week in advance. Rochelle and Greg were awaiting sentencing, and my cameras, still up, still legal, but the only thing they recorded now was peace. The morning Rochelle's sentencing hearing began, I arrived early enough to watch the court staff set up. It wasn't out of curiosity. It was about closure. The prosecutor, an older woman with a voice like gravel and zero tolerance for nonsense, had prepared this case with surgical precision. I'd handed over everything I had months ago. Every time-stamped document, every ledger Darren uncovered, every camera angle that captured what the board had been doing in the dark. This wasn't about a fine anymore. It was about fraud, and the charges stuck. Rochelle sat beside her defense attorney, wrists resting on the table, a pale blue blazer stretched too tightly over her shoulders. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at anyone since the plea deal fell apart. Apparently, she thought the court would go easy if she offered to repay some of the stolen money and step away from HOA affairs permanently. The judge refused. Intentional deception carried out over the course of several years is not something we negotiate down to a slap on the wrist, the judge had said during the last pre-trial hearing. Especially when it involved the systematic intimidation of community residents. Now she faced sentencing. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, a tall man with thick glasses and a calm but commanding tone, reviewed the findings without emotion. He referenced the fabricated vendor accounts, the unauthorized withdrawals, and the threats used to suppress dissent. Then he turned to Rochelle. "You held a position of trust," he said, "and you used that position to manipulate, intimidate, and steal from people who relied on you to protect their homes and livelihoods." Rochelle opened her mouth to respond, but her attorney placed a hand on her arm. She stayed silent. The judge continued. "Financial theft is one thing, but what's particularly egregious in your case is the psychological campaign you waged against your neighbors. You created a climate of fear, not to enforce community standards, but to shield misconduct. That is not leadership. That is coercion." He issued the sentence. 2 years in county custody, followed by 5 years of supervised release with mandatory restitution. Rochelle blinked hard but didn't cry. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters waited. I kept walking. There was nothing left to say. Back in the neighborhood, something unexpected had started to happen. Without the constant pressure from the previous board, residents were actually talking again, not just about HOA elections or landscaping ordinances, but about everything. Birthdays, retirements, weekend projects. It felt like a neighborhood again, instead of a monitored zone. The newly elected board, 5 volunteers with no prior ties to Rochelle or Greg, operated with complete transparency. Meeting minutes were posted online within 48 hours. Budgets were reviewed in open forums. Even the annual dues were lowered slightly after a full audit revealed a surplus hidden under inflated security fees. One afternoon, while replacing the weather stripping on my garage door, Darren stopped by. He looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "Got a letter from the county," he said. "They're adding me to their advisory panel for HOA compliance. Asked if I'd help them write a handbook for residents dealing with overreach." "That's solid," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "You deserve it." He glanced up at one of the cameras still mounted under my roofline. "You keeping those up?" "Absolutely," he nodded. "Funny how it all started because you didn't take one down." "Not that funny when you think about it," I replied. "People like Rochelle count on silence, count on compliance. The second you record what they're doing, their whole world shrinks." Later that week, I received a letter in the mail from the state attorney's office. It confirmed that Greg had accepted a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation. He turned over the names of 3 other individuals who helped him create the shell accounts, including a property management consultant who'd been forging invoices for years. One of them had even created fake tenant complaints to justify extra charges on the HOA's budget. They would all be prosecuted separately. The neighborhood voted unanimously to prohibit paid management firms without a 3/4 majority. From now on, any decision involving outside contractors required open bidding and at least 2 homeowner observers present during negotiations. No exceptions. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the rooftops, I stood in my backyard with a beer and watched my neighbor, the same nurse who'd once been threatened for parking in her own driveway, hang string lights over her patio for a family gathering. Music drifted over the fence. Old soul, soft and warm, she waved. I waved back. The cameras were still rolling, but they weren't watching for threats anymore. They were just part of the landscape now, quiet reminders that accountability wasn't optional. A few weeks later, the city organized a forum on HOA reform at the local library. They asked me to speak. I kept it short. People always say power corrupts, I said to a room full of homeowners, city planners, and legal aides. But it's not power that's the problem. It's the silence that lets it grow. The second you shine a light on it, things change. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but they change. After the event, a man approached me mid-50s, hands rough like a mechanic's. I put up a camera last week, he said. Got a letter the next day. I sent them a copy of the statute you cited in court. Haven't heard back. I grinned. Give them time. They're probably still looking it up. By summer, the neighborhood had added a community garden where the old HOA office used to sit. The city had condemned the structure after discovering multiple safety violations, including exposed wiring and black mold behind the drywall. The new board decided to raze it completely and replaced it with raised beds, benches, and a tool shed. On the garden fence hung a small wooden sign carved by Mr. Patel's grandson. It read, "For everyone, no exceptions." I passed it often on my evening walks, and every time I thought about Rochelle's face in that courtroom when the judge said the words she never expected to hear. It's his property right. She hadn't moved since. Her expression didn't change. She didn't argue or protest. She just sat there quiet, smaller than I'd ever seen her, while the system she tried to manipulate finally told her no. That was the real victory, not the cameras, not the court case. Not even the restitution. It was watching the power she abused collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Sometimes justice doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives slowly, in motion-activated clips and public hearings and neighborhood votes. Sometimes it comes when a man puts up a camera and a woman tells him he can't, and then a judge tells her she's wrong, so I kept the footage, all of it, not for revenge, not even as proof, but because history once recorded doesn't argue, it just waits.